Добрий день, я вітаю всіх, хто приєднався до нас. Мене звуть Ольга.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you in Ukraine Media Center. It's been 11 years of the war, and today is day 979 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And today we will be talking on specifically important topics important in the conditions of the full-scale invasion. We will be discussing rehabilitation and prosthetics. So the topic of our today's event is the changes that have happened and are about to happen next year. So let me introduce our speakers today. Joining us today are Tetiana Baryshok, head of the board of the NGO All-Ukrainian Association of Physiotherapists. Also joining us is Anastasiia Pampukha, strategic advisor for policy development and legal support patients of Ukraine. And right about to join us is Olena Kulchytska, advisor to the Minister of Social Policy. So the topic is important. We see within the last couple of years that the changes that are happening in scientific rehabilitation are significant. They are noteworthy. We were standing in one place, but the full-scale invasion has given us that momentum that we're sensing now. So let's talk about what has changed within these almost 3 years of the full-scale invasion. And today, the scientific rehabilitation, what does it look like? I just want our spectators to understand what we're talking about as we're talking about rehabilitation. How can the patients understand whether it's what we're talking about or not? Well, good morning. Well, basically, you've put a lot of questions into one question. Well, talking about what changed in evidence-based rehabilitation within the last 3 years, probably even earlier than the full-scale invasion, the National Health Service of Ukraine has come up with the pre-rehabilitation services packages in the ambulatories and hospitals, and all of the network of the country is represented by cluster and over-cluster hospitals. They have open departments that provide rehabilitation services, multidisciplinary teams, services for the most difficult patients that require rehabilitation. The number of the facilities has been growing. I don't have the exact figure now because it may be different from the latest figures that I was getting from the National Health Service, but all of the capable network provides rehabilitation services. They are in compliance with the requirements by the National Healthcare Service. The specialists involved in the processes are the ergotherapists, logopedists, the psychologists are involved as well. There are physiotherapists in all of the teams, and that's a drastic change comparing to the Soviet model when the rehabilitation was frequently a part of sanatorium treatment. It was more of a something like spa, if I may say. Well, but that was the reality, actually. And in the healthcare facilities, no one was talking about some acute rehabilitation, post-acute rehabilitation, such significant things as neural system. And now all those things are developing. They're developing in different ways because there are different capabilities in different regions. We cannot compare the regions that were affected by the battle operations. Many specialists were forced to leave. In some regions, the education was weaker and it has only just started developing. Well, the things are different everywhere. In some places there are still some post-Soviet traditions, and it looks just like like a change of logotype, but there are serious teams that provide serious rehabilitation services. Well, we are aware of the Baltic countries' experience. Everything was getting gradually within 20 years. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time given all of the challenges we're facing during the full-scale invasions. So, to what extent, in your opinion, is medical personnel ready to those changes? How do they perceive them? What is your sentiment? Are we really moving? Well, we are witnessing a crazy resistance of a system. Well, to change any system, you have to use a lot of effort, but on the other hand, we see the demand on part of the society. We see their demand on part of the specialists, those who are really devoted to their profession. And I frankly believe that the quality will overcome, and we will be able to build the system that is going to be accessible and that is going to provide quality services to all of the citizens of Ukraine. Because shouldn't we believe in it, probably we wouldn't have be involved in it. And the young specialists that keep coming, they are already different, and it already looks inspiring. Talking about the resistance, I think that it's normal, that's predictable. Well, there is resistance to any reforms, because hearing, for example, that we have been doing this thing for like 30 years, and you come here with your evidence-based rehabilitation, like look at our laser therapy, our baths, our mineral waters. Well, we're doing fine here, but again, that's a process of enlightenment, of education of the younger ones, of those who have been working for a long time and they've never seen things happen in a different way. There's the process of normative regulation when there is certain degree of quality required that is being evaluated. So all of the processes, they are aimed at one goal: quality, accessible, evidence-based rehabilitation. Well, let's stop right here. We understand that evidence-based rehabilitation is no massage or electrophoresis. So what is evidence-based rehabilitation, and how a patient can understand that they receive a quality evidence-based rehabilitation rather than any other type of service? Well, I think that I have to make a step back here and mention that usually when people talk about rehabilitation, the patients say, well, I loved it. I felt fine. Well, but basically we love a lot of things in our life, and they have no relation to rehabilitation. So good attitude, good, say, meals, barrier-free space is no rehabilitation. It's a standard. It's a standard that should be implemented one way or another. But basically now the attitude to the patients have changed. The conditions in many medical facilities, there is new outfitting. In many facilities, there is a barrier-free space being built, but that's the standard of service. They don't represent the rehabilitation by themselves. Well, a condition how a patient can evaluate it, first of all, they should have normal contact with all of the specialists who work with them. They are supposed to understand what is the goal. Yeah, they should understand the final goal. Just like we talk it in smart format, it's not mandatory for the patients to approach it from that side, but the patients should realize what they get during those 2 or 3 weeks of rehabilitation. That should be very specific goal, like stand up on their feet and make 10 steps. Yes, that's a very specific goal. Whether they do it by themselves or with some support devices, or to master some skill of doing something, say dress themselves by them. Well, it's a broad like statement, but to do something on their own. The goal is not only to renew, because it may be a multi-cycle goal. What do you mean by renew? To feel happy, to get back to your job, to bring your kid to a kindergarten, to be able to cook a coffee for yourself, or meet a friend by a cup of coffee. So that's the goal. The goal is individual, and it should be discussed with the therapist, because the goal should be based on the desires, on the necessities of a patient. It should be clear and measurable, just like you said. Make that number of steps, right? And talking about it, rehabilitation is never passive. It's not. It's functional. Well, there may be some passive things used in some conditions, and some passive measures. I'm not saying that rehabilitation should be only active, but it's generally active. You cannot achieve an active goal using passive means of rehabilitation. So basically, during the period of rehabilitation, the patients do some active, do some activities. Yeah, and they should be involved in the process to the maximum extent, because when you're involved in the process, you study, you learn. That's kind of a learning process, and when a person is getting involved in the process, both mentally and physically, the result will be way better than if a person just passively sits back or lies back, and the medical assistants are just making some manipulations with them. The patients should obtain subjectivity in this process. So evidence-based rehabilitation, if we talk about some modern rehabilitation that we are building, rehabilitation that we want to see in Ukraine, is a kind of rehabilitation when the patient is being thoroughly examined, and the doctor with the patient, they together set a goal, an achievable goal, when all of the interventions are aimed at achieving this goal, and the person understands why they do something. There is such a very, very easy formula. If you want to walk, start walking, learn to walk. And if you want to achieve some functional goal, like to adapt to something, to renew some type of activity, we have to do it in our everyday rehabilitation cycle. Well, there are different means. There are passive means, but they should not prevail. They should be used from the point of view of their evidence base and their optimal optimal meaning. The specialist should be able to answer the patient's questions, and the patient should understand that their processes are all individual. They may have something in common with the others, but it's not a team training. Like we stand in circle and we start using different machines. It's not an individual approach. It's not achievement of a personal goal. It's definitely not a teamwork, because when we talk about difficult patients who have a lot of needs, our facilities should be able to build such conditions in which the patients can train individually. Well, how many hours this active training phase should last per day? Well, according to the requirements of National Healthcare Service, it takes 3 hours of active therapeutical sessions. I'm talking about the work with the physical therapists and logopedists. Well, aren't the patients supposed to feel tired? Well, depending on the goal, I think it's normal for certain conditions. Thank you very much. We will be back to this topic. Miss Anastasiia, I would like to ask you a question. Talking about the achievements of our rehabilitation, I would like to ask about the legal side. Is everything sufficient for the process to develop organically, or we have a lot of things to work on in the legal dimension? Well, when it comes to regulations, the legal people, the lawyers will be never left without jobs. But again, we've achieved a lot within the last year. For example, the Ministry of Health, in coordination with the Ministry of Social Policies, finally implemented the option of assistance of social workers. So in the healthcare facilities during rehabilitation, there is a social worker who supports a person on every stage of rehabilitation. They help in solving issues related to documents, for example, to processing of different social services, or acquisition of support devices for rehabilitation. I think that's a huge shift, and I think we should thank our ministers for that. And talking about some achievements in terms of regulations, this year 2 new material tables were approved. Previously, we had a report card approved for the adults, but we know that the children are different. That's why the equipment and outfitting in the children's medical facilities should be different. Well, first it happened so that the rehabilitation was mostly focused on development of the adults, but now the state had finally seen that it has to pay attention to the children as well. That's now all those developments in the regulations are going on now. Another cool achievement was that this year such a notion as rehabilitation capacity of the medical facilities was implemented. What was the problem? National Healthcare Service pays well for the services. Well, no matter what the people say, that the money is never enough, but definitely the services can be provided not for 100 like 10,000 hryvnia, but for 150. But the demand for contracting the packages is good, and the payment for them is decent too. And for example, there are say 2 physical therapists and 2 ergotherapists working in a healthcare facility, and they process 350 patients per month. And it's clear that this number of specialists cannot provide quality help to that number of patients. Like Tetiana has said, there is a requirement about the daily hours of load on the patients. But there is also the standard for workload of the therapists themselves. That's why, thanks to the simple calculations, how many hours of rehabilitation the patients need and how many hours the rehabilitation specialist can dedicate to them, then based on that, the capacity or capability formula was adopted for this facilities that provide such rehabilitation services. It helps a lot to screen those facilities who don't provide quality services. It allows us to avoid those team trainings that Tetiana described as a non-quality service. Then there was another problem that we started solving this year. The facilities didn't want to accept difficult patients. For example, there are patients with a pain in the back, and there is a person with a spinal trauma, and the payment for them was the same, and it was enough to work with them
1 hour, like psychologist, physical patients, and that's it. And a patient with a spinal trauma, with a spinal injury, requires a lot of medical attention. That's exactly why the Ministry of Health developed this list of conditions based on their complexity. We had our experts involved who helped the Ministry of Health to sort those conditions by group, depending on their complexity, and depending on their complexity, there are rates that increase the payment or decrease it. And now the healthcare facilities are really interested in providing high quality help to our defenders, because previously they didn't have a stimulus for that, and on top of that they didn't know how to do it. Now the things have changed, and now the healthcare facilities are fighting for such patients. I think that's an achievement. Well, and talking about the regulations purely, there is such a notion as a sectoral standards in the area of healthcare. Those are the documents that describe the evidence-based rehabilitation. They describe the procedures, who should do what in provision of those services. Previously, there was only a notion of medical aid standards, but there was no standard for rehabilitation. And thanks to those amendments to the regulations, including to the law of Ukraine on healthcare, now we have this notion, we have this phenomena, and we may describe the standards for rehabilitation support. Now there are changes already prepared to the law on Ukraine on healthcare that continue with the standard and are finalized with the protocol for medical services provision. There are task forces that develop those documents that are already in place. There is a group on development of sectoral standards for bone fractures, strokes, amputations, spinal injuries. So basically all those documents are being developed already. And now that we've touched upon the topic of amputation, I will rush a little bit ahead and say that we are really waiting that shortly the decree of the Ministry of Health will be approved that regulates provision of medical services or specifically specialized medical aid on osteointegration. That's a unique, well, I've never seen it, it's a unique method of prosthetics that raises a lot of questions in the expert community, and it requires certain counterbalances and framework. First of all, in order not to produce any harm, first of all, the people, the patients, choose their methods of prosthetics, but the state is supposed to set certain framework, and that decree specifically describes safe approaches to such treatments. Well, Anastasiia, talking about the topic of rehabilitation, now that our spectators are listening to us, and if they try to analyze, for example, they are the users of those services and you provide those services to them, and as they try to analyze that service that they obtain, for example, they understand they get those services with the collective approach and they understand it shouldn't be working like that, or maybe the physical load is too low. Do our patients have any levers to make sure that they get quality services, that they get evidence-based services, that they get efficient services? Well, let me describe the steps of a patient in the way that I would do it. If I've noticed that the rehabilitation specialist doesn't pay proper attention to me, doesn't do exercises with me, for example, well, I'm staying in an inpatient department. I'm just lying in my bunk without being rehabilitated. I would first talk to a person who works with me. I would like to ask for my individual rehabilitation plan. What does it include? How many trainings per day am I getting? So first I would discuss it with the rehabilitation specialist and with the doctor who is supposed to head this process, because they are supposed to be the heads of the multidisciplinary teams. If it would have no effect on what's happening to me, I would go to the head of the rehabilitation department, and then I would either, or in parallel with that, I would call to the hotline of the National Healthcare Service and tell them that there are problems like this and that, so please influence that. And I'm sure National Healthcare Service has certain methods of influence as long as they pay for those services. So I think a call to the hotline of National Healthcare Service, I think it's a critical lever of influence, but again, this call should be sufficient. Well, thank you very much. Let's proceed to the topic of prosthetics. Miss Olena, what is the number of people who've taken advantage of this program, and how can others who want to take advantage can do that? Well, good morning. The prosthetics program has been existing for a number of years. It was actively functioning before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and it's clear that with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, it started facing unprecedented challenges that are unique in global history, because modern history doesn't know examples of such an intense combat operations that resulted in amputation of a lot of patients who get treatment, who get prosthetics in their country where those combat operations are taking place. Well, obviously there are countries. Well, the closest example is Israel, but over there the periods of active combat operations are short. Soon it will be 3 years of the full-scale invasion. Before that, there were 7 years of combat operations of local nature. And within all that period, the prosthetic system was developing. It continues developing until this moment, basically trying to work hand in hand with the rehabilitation system. As of the beginning of this year, almost 10,000 persons were provided with prosthetics. Basically, we group them by rehabilitation devices, and in one group we have prosthetics and orthopedical prosthetics. And this year we've provided more than 2,500 prosthetics to the military, and basically that number, that 10,000, were provided with 16,000 devices, because a military are entitled, the veterans are entitled to different types of prosthetics. Well, basically they are entitled to both mechanical, bionic, and swimming prosthetics, and it's not a matter of a person's desire, but it's more of a opinion of a specialist, what kind of prosthetics better fit their patients. Well, we were trying to make sure the institutions are becoming friends, but we're not calling the prosthetic specialists to be hired by the hospitals, but they are supposed to be part of the multidisciplinary rehabilitation teams. It's normal to get the prosthetic manufacturers involved in providing services at certain healthcare facilities that are located nearby, but According to the regulation, the healthcare facilities should enter into memorandum with the prosthetic facilities because, for example, there are big prosthetic enterprises, big prosthetic companies in Odessa. It doesn't necessarily mean that they should cooperate with the hospitals in Ivano-Frankivsk region. And also what's important, as Ms. Tetiana has mentioned today, we're witnessing the resistance of the old system. There's a huge number of prosthetic systems who have been working in the system for more than 20 years, and they think they know things better than the specialists in rehabilitation, and they frequently don't listen to the rehabilitation specialists, and it's not a quality approach because sometimes we have a situation when the rehabilitation specialists have to come up with the type of the prosthetics, and the prosthetics themselves are being manufactured by the prosthetic specialists who may impose at some unnecessary part, but because unfortunately there are people who want to do better to their patients, but there are those who want to make more, unfortunately so far. And hopefully with the 1st of January 2025, the new amendments to the law on healthcare will start working, and the multidisciplinary rehabilitation teams will provide all of the recommendations and requirements to the prosthetics. And in case of a light injury, like a finger prosthetics, it can be already defined by the prosthetic specialist. Well, this is the process that we were approaching to within 2 years. We just wanted to make sure that those appointments are happening in the electronic healthcare system. It could provide us with an opportunity to forecast the demand for future, because currently we formulate our budget post factum based on the number of the applications within the last year and those whom we expect to come for us for maintenance or repairs. Currently, we're getting no adequate statistics from the area of healthcare because it's all disseminated. Some of the information is being aggregated by the military hospitals, some of the information is being aggregated by the multidisciplinary rehabilitation teams, and when the patients are through all of the examinations, it's already too late for them to pick the right prosthetic device, because we have a lot of military who were affected by the war, and those who need those prosthetic devices on a long-term basis, it should be confirmed by the multidisciplinary rehabilitation team rather than medical disability commission. Well, from time to time we keep seeing different fundraisers for prosthetics or other prosthetic devices. Well, those fundraisers don't come in such huge numbers as they used to be, but they still exist. And why do they continue existing? Is it because people just want those bionic prosthetics that the state does or does not cover? What is the reason behind that? Well, there's a number of circumstances behind and conditions behind that. First of all, our system of regulation contemplates that the primary prosthetics is done by the primary prosthetic device, and in a year veterans are entitled to ask for another prosthetics which are more costly. For example, the hip prosthetic costs 2 million hryvnia. Within this amount, we can get the best prosthetics from the best global manufacturers. Obviously, there are like super expensive prosthetics that have some additional characteristics, additional functionality, but they are not different in terms of their basic functions. We understand that the market of prosthetic components, they react to such a demand because we understand that if we are a country that consumes a lot of prosthetic components, the manufacturers may sell us more and more. And here the prosthetic manufacturers are competing. Who can provide us with more and better components? There are different marketing strategies involved too. Very frequently, the new prosthetics like A-limb, the new generation is only different with compared to the older generation. It's only different with the one specific grip that the person's never use in their real life. Just like new iPhones, they come in different shapes but with the same characteristics. So basically, we may want to provide our patients with the best prosthetics, but the issue is that the most expensive prosthetics are not always the best. When we were studying in the United States of America, we were talking to representatives of different ministries, and they were saying that the military are being provided with the super expensive prosthetics, but then they put it in their balconies, say, as a support for the flower pot. So for us, it's important to have the state program not to issue the most expensive prosthetic, but it should result in the most efficient prosthetics being matched for their patients by the multidisciplinary rehabilitation teams. Well, sometimes it may happen that it could be that most expensive prosthetics, but in the majority of cases, the amount allocated by the state would be sufficient. For us, it's important to understand, for example, why do we need these extra functional prosthetics? Because sometimes we're facing like real difficult injuries, and sometimes people are not ready to get those improved prosthetics 3 months after injury, because sometimes after the 3 months they may not be ready to withstand all that physical load. After all, our army is not professional here. Many people who are currently injured, they are like average statistical individuals. Their bodies were not prepared during those military trainings. They are not professional military, like, for example, Israeli army, or like the United States Army veterans, who are more functionally ready to get prosthetics like this. In our realities, the person's conditions are changing within the first year. Well, I'm really humbled by this approach, about which I've heard that a person should be in the center of rehabilitation team. The patient should be in the center of rehabilitation team, and the same applies to prosthetics. People shouldn't be waiting for the prosthetic specialist to come and do some magic, and then the patients would be able to run immediately. It all starts with the first step, 2 or 3 or 5. So it's about the patients using their efforts to master those prosthetic devices. For example, many people ask for bionic prosthetics, but then they reject them because sometimes it takes 3 months to master bionic prosthetics, because you have to reconfigure your body, reconfigure your brain to use the spatula muscle to bend the fingers, for example. Well, Miss Tetiana, as a person who provides rehabilitation services, I would like to ask you, what is your opinion of those prosthetics? Previously, it was fashionable to say that people should get prosthetics somewhere abroad, but now I think everybody understands that there are quality companies in Ukraine that manufacture this type of products on a quality basis. What's your opinion? Is it worth going abroad for prosthetics, or there are other approaches here in place? Well, let me correct you. I'm not practicing. I'm more on the side of advocacy and education. Well, basically, I'm an education person, so, but talking about prosthetics, you better ask the specialists who work directly with them, or ask them directly. But there are many colleagues that I know who have successful cases in situations that Olena has described, when there is good cooperation, when those specialists are being listened to, who prepare the patients to pre-prosthetic rehabilitation, who are responsible for pre-prosthetic rehabilitation. In case of lower limbs, is the job of physical therapists, and they are providing good feedback on prosthetic specialists when they are being asked, not in a situation when a patient disappears and then they come with an installed prosthetics, and they tell the rehabilitologist, like, teach me to walk now. Sometimes the rehabilitologist may have no capability to teach them to walk, because, well, I've seen a lot of my colleagues who attend different trainings, or the physical therapists who work in cooperation with the prosthetic therapists. So in this case, I stand for full cooperation from the very beginning to provide the most efficient service. And even when we were talking to our foreign colleagues, they were all saying that in prosthetics it is important to establish cooperation between the prosthetic specialist and the specialist who works directly with the patients. So the idea of involving them in the teams and having direct contracts with the institutions that provide prosthetic services is a modern approach. Well, it's bad that sometimes it only works on paper, but in situations when it does work in real life, when people do cooperate, there's always good result, which is way better when everybody acts on themselves, because prosthetics cannot be separated from rehabilitation processes. That's what I can state for sure. Talking about foreign prosthetics coming from abroad or not from abroad, let me comment it from another standpoint. A specialist has to well, the patient should undergo some technical maintenance. Let's not forget about it as well. And we hope that rehabilitation is going to develop in the communities, and that the rehabilitation will be closer to the patients. So the closer the rehabilitation process is to the family, the better it is for the patients emotionally and for their families. That's why, if there are specialists available, it's better to use those specialists who are closer to the families. Well, development in the communities, you've touched upon this topic. What is your opinion? Where are we now in these terms? Can we already boast some positive experience from the point of view of availability of rehabilitation services in the community? I mean, evidence-based quality services. And what's ahead of us? Are we ready to take some speedy steps to come to this in all of the communities? Well, it's a multi-layer question. It's not it was usually omitted. Well, it was always important to rehabilitate the most difficult patients in the big medical facilities where many teams are employed. Well, they should be developed, they should be provided new opportunities for development, they should be provided resources, but they exist, they are in place. And as we talk about the community, well, the communities are different. And in some communities, the rehabilitation is already in place. In some communities, it's weaker. But my colleagues usually help those institutions to develop, and they say that there are really cool, serious results when you come. And even in a small town, you see a rehabilitation department and you see people working there, that they take efforts, they establish barrier-free space, and it looks inspiring. But there are situations in which people cannot find specialists. That's one of the problems that creates a barrier for the communities. It's easier to find specialists in the bigger cities rather than in the smaller towns, let alone the whole team. Is really a challenge for a community. If it's a big community situated near a big city, that's one story, but if it's a remote community, that's a whole different story. Globally talking about the global practice, the closer it is to the home, the better it is to the patient. Going 200 kilometers to a specialist, well, that should be something really necessary. According to WHO data, we have the biggest demand for different spinal conditions. People in those cases don't have to overcome some huge distances to get some team service or something like that. That's why one of the solutions in this situation, I mean, in terms of development of rehabilitation in the communities, me and my colleagues, we see it as development of mono-service. When in the bigger cities or in smaller towns, the specialist should be provided with an option, like when it comes to stable conditions, when those specialists should be provided an option of providing rehabilitation services. For example, when person requires only one type of service, or they require different types of service from one specialist. We've seen this approach in a number of countries with the highly developed rehabilitation. They all have standalone services provided by different rehabilitation specialists, and it significantly reduces the load on the system that is supposed to treat the difficult patients, because it results in a situation that Nastya has described. When an easy patient is being put to the hospital, only the medical facility could get money for them. But we aspire to development of this mono service. We expect it to happen within the foreseeable future. It's going to give the momentum to the development of the system, even when all of the specialists are not present. At least some part of the people can get some level of services at the level, some amount of services at the level of the community. Also, we have, for example, private sector that is more costly, that cannot be afforded by the majority. So I think that it would be normal that those specialists can provide their services within the medical packages, well, based on the conditions on their patients. Thank you very much. I would like to touch upon yet another question, another topic. We're short on time, but there is another problem sitting in this surface. Frequently, our defenders, as they get injured, they say that this time between the treatment and rehabilitation is frequently lost. This rehabilitation tool is being lost within a month or two. Sometimes it takes up to half a year. So are there any changes planned here that would allow to improve this patient's path to make sure that such component as rehabilitation comes earlier? Well, from the point of view of professional community, I can say that there may be different mechanisms used to mitigate it. For example, for some conditions, there are decrees on forwarding the patients to make sure that those protocols work, because we have many healthcare facilities that submit to different ministries that complicates the patient's path. On the other hand, it's important for the specialists, and I still hope we are going to be helped by the protocols or clinical cars that are being already processed on the level of legislation. They were given the green light because the rehabilitation should be going on in parallel with the treatment and then continue if a patient requires, but the existence of these gaps is maybe an issue on part of the medical facilities. Sometimes it's a matter of queues. Sometimes there are patients staying in inpatient departments who don't really require such a long rehabilitation. So it's mostly there may be a number of issues related to faithfulness, like whether it's a difficult patient or not. And we have some difficult, say, obsolete traditions, like let them spend some time at home and then come to rehabilitation. This is something that we should fight against using our enlightenment, inspections, I don't know, different measures, education, but this problem is in place. We touch upon it and we continue asserting that the patients during the period of acute rehabilitation, where they should be staying in ICU, there should be a rehabilitation specialist admitted to the patients who could start providing rehabilitation services right on spot, and then continue supporting them at rehabilitation facilities. We have such specialists, but usually they are overloaded with work. Thank you very much. Nastya, you're a representative of a non-government organization that works with the patients, and it's important for us to understand how do the patients evaluate the quality of rehabilitation services provided by the state of Ukraine. Do you understand this feedback? I'm a representative of NGO, but I mostly work with the central executive authorities. However, recently I had an experience of communicating with patients. I cannot disclose all of the details. Well, there will be an official report. The only thing I can say, I want to say, my personal impression, that is not related to report and monitoring, but what I've seen that the people are satisfied. However, I, as a specialist who understands what should be going on during rehabilitation, what is evidence-based service, what is a quality service, I wouldn't be satisfied, because when person is being provided with a smile, human attitude, 3 meals per day, normal conditions of stay, barrier-free space, people start thinking that it's a classy service, because they are not being slapped with a wet rag, something like that. Well, basically, we have to communicate it to our patients, like Tetiana has said, that normal attitude, normal conditions is the basic standard. It's not a part of a service. that is a precondition for a service. Well, I'm not saying that this is the case for all of the healthcare facilities, but I think it all depends on the facility itself, on its team, the goals of the facility management, because I am aware of the institutions who pull our defenders from such conditions that honestly I was really impressed. I had tears in my eyes. I apologize for such words, but I was thinking those people would never be able to do anything, but people without, say, legs or hands, they can sit in their beds, but there are healthcare facilities that collect 300 patients. They bathe them, they treat them with lasers, and they get their money. Well, so the expectations of the Ukrainian patients are on the level of their basic physiological necessities, so to say. Well, we have patients who really very frequently, well, some of them had experience of staying in hospitals where they were getting different attitude, and when those things are changing, that's real cool, but that's a basic standard again. And our way is the demand of the society for quality rehabilitation and education of their families, education of all those who are related to service providers. Like, we should orient them at that, like, this is the type of rehabilitation that we want to get, when people understand what they were trained to do, what they were taught to do, to add something to their activities. And yeah, just a couple of sentences to finalize it. The rehabilitation and prosthetic spheres are similar, just like the healthcare funding, in a sense that the patients are not becoming parts to the funding processes. They think like, well, it's cool, it's free. Good, it happens like this, that finally we live to see the dead, but in fact the state allocates a lot for rehabilitation packages and those prosthetics. And obviously we cannot expect every patient to become a rehabilitation expert, to be able to say, well, I was not provided the amount of services equal to this amount of money, but the patients should not lower their requirements. They should not try to offend or not offend the members of multidisciplinary team. If the patients, if the method of treatment doesn't or rehabilitation doesn't fit the patients, they should say so. The government extends a lot of money. Unfortunately, that's not our taxpayers' money, because our healthcare sector is being funded by our foreign partners. But one way or another, we don't have to accept it to, like, well, as long as it comes for free, good, they did it like that. No way. The patient should be aware of their rights and responsibilities, and they should protect them. We keep emphasizing it in our practice. It was happening a lot of times when the patients were living unsatisfied, but they don't complain, they don't submit any reports that was a low quality service, let's respond to it. There's a minimal number of people who really submit any complaints whatsoever. So you cannot expect a person to be satisfied with the improvement of attitude to the patients. What is supposed to be improved is the quality of prosthetics, quality of rehabilitation services. This is when we achieve the results we're aspiring to, because our society needs to become inclusive, because otherwise we'll just lock those people in their apartments and their dwellings if we don't make all of the, I don't know, railroad stations, shops, pharmacies, everything, all of the spaces barrier-free. But we shouldn't get satisfied with some average quality or mediocre quality. Well, I would like to thank you for this conversation, and I would like to thank everybody who is walking this path to evidence-based quality rehabilitation. Let's not stop where we are. Let's discuss the better patients, better results for our patients, better results for our defenders, those who require rehabilitation. Just remember that you are entitled to all of those services. And the main quotation of today is that your rehabilitation should end in some specific result that you aspire to. I want to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can hold events like this. Let's continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.